So I'm out here putting water in the pool, and I wanted to tell you more stories about my Mormon childhood. Like I said, I grew up in Idaho on a small farm. And I think for my father, even though he was a convert to the church in some ways, you know, his mother was raised Mormon, but his father was, like I said, a whiskey drinking, poker playing, chain smoking, and I'm not going to say the last word, what I believe he was. So my father probably grew up with a more balanced view of the world than my mother did, because my mother was very staunch Mormon. So I do appreciate that I grew up Mormon. I appreciate all of the things I learned, the things I was taught. But my father and my mother were from the Depression, and my dad was born in 1928, and my mother was born in 1935. And so my dad, he was the oldest of his siblings. He understood more than my mother what it was like to be poor and not have. And I am sure, it's my belief that my father suffered as the oldest child with a father who came back from, well, before my dad was born, I'm sure, my grandfather came back from World War I, and he had gotten mustard gas in his lungs, so one of his lungs had been eaten, so he only had one lung. And I don't know if that's why he wasn't able to work, or if he was just I'm not sure. I was really young when he died, so I don't know what the reasons were. But I often wondered if my father respected his father, but my father never, ever talked about his father to us. And he never really talked about his mother either. But I think my father wanted to teach his children to be self-sufficient. Even though the Mormon church taught you to be self-sufficient and to have food storage and plant gardens and not rely on the government, that was a big thing. My father, I think, felt more than my mother ever felt the stress of growing up in the Depression and growing up in the poorest family in the town that he grew up in. And like I said, my father was a silent man. He kept a lot of his feelings to himself. But I would think that as the oldest child and the oldest son, that would be really hard on your pride, your ego, to grow up in a small town and be the poorest family in town. And I think that pushed my father to become the man that he became. He did not want to be like his father, I don't believe. He wanted to be different and have a better life. So my father wanted us to learn how to be self-sufficient. So we grew up on this small farm, and my mother too, but my father, I think from his experience, really wanted that. My father was a hunter and a fisherman. My mother also hunted and fished, but more of a fisherman than a hunter. And my father would go, shoot a deer every fall and bring it home so that we would have a freezer full of meat through the winter. And on this small farm that we had, my dad would have like one milk cow, and every morning he would get up early in the morning and he would milk the cow in the morning and milk the cow at night. And some of those mornings I remember going out with my cup so that my dad could fill it up with warm milk from the cow, and I would drink it before I went to school. And my dad would bring the milk into the house, and it was the girls' job to strain the milk and pour it into gallon jars and put that in the refrigerator. And the boys and my father would gather the chicken eggs, and then we would have to scrub the chicken eggs clean and put them in cartons and put those in the refrigerator. And, you know, we would sell that to the neighbors sometimes, but we had like a couple of horses, a cow for milking. Actually, it was our pet cow named Cinnamon. And then we had a calf that my father would raise for beef. And then we had some pigs and goats, guinea pigs, chickens. We had a really mean banny rooster. And we had geese. And I think we had some ducks maybe at one time. But my father would get up and go milk the cow, and then he would go to work at the airport, and then he would come home at 5 o'clock, 5:30, and get his work boots back on and go back out and do more chores, because we had animals and big gardens, and my dad loved being a green thumb, so he loved planting everything that was on the property that we had. But my mother also would do her thing, where when we were kids, we would get up and go to school early in the morning. We'd go get on the bus. And when we would come home, my mom would have like, Mormons don't do anything small. Everything is big, like over the top, because they have big families and lots of children. My mom and dad had 8 children, so my mom would have like 15 loaves of hot bread right out of the oven. And yes, I said that right, 15 loaves of hot bread when we would come home from school. And we would like eat 5 or 6 of those loaves as a snack after school. My mom was a home economics major, so she would have hot cookies, like thumbprint cookies. She would have cinnamon rolls. It just depended. But we would come home, and my mother would have something that she had baked hot sitting there on the counter waiting for us. And we had, you know, all the milk that we wanted from the cow, so we could like eat all of the pastries that we wanted and drink all the milk that we wanted. And one of the things I loved the most was we had our own raspberries, and we would make freezer jam, because everything that we planted or grew, we would can or dry or freeze, whether it was meat or garden produce. So every winter my dad would order like 50 baby chicks, and they actually at that time would mail them to you like in the 1970s. And we would get these baby chicks, and my father, because it's winter in Idaho and very cold, would keep the baby chicks in the bathroom in a big cardboard box. And we would take care of them in the house until it became spring and warm enough to put them out under the incubator in the chicken coop. And every year, my dad would order 50 baby chicks, and then every year when they got big enough, he would tell us it was time to kill the chickens and pluck them and put them in the freezer. So my dad would get the axe and catch the chickens and put their head between two nails on a log that he had and chop their heads off. Then it was our job to run after them and catch their flopping bodies and carry them into the house where my mom had a big pot of hot boiling water. And she would put them in that hot boiling water for a few minutes, and then we would pluck chickens as a family. I remember when my dad finally found a guy who would do that whole job and charged a reasonable price, and that included, butchering them and packaging them in freezer wrap, and we didn't have to do that anymore. Hallelujah. That was a great day. So happy my dad found that guy. Because our chicken plucking days were over. But what I was going to tell you was we would make freezer jam. And we would freeze also corn. We would take the corn off the cob and freeze corn. We would can string beans and tomatoes and peaches. And I think my favorite thing was freezer jam. And I don't know if you've ever had freezer jam, but it is the most delicious thing you've ever tasted on hot bread right out of the oven. Hot homemade white bread with butter, and then that cold freezer jam. And we had apricot freezer jam, apricot pineapple freezer jam, raspberry freezer jam, strawberry freezer jam. And of course my favorite was raspberry. When I came to California and saw the price of raspberries, I was so sad because I never paid for raspberries and I never paid to eat them. We would just pick them and we would make freezer jam. And anyway, very fond memories of all of the good things that we had growing up as a Mormon. And really kind of like, I know it sounds funny, but kind of like Little House on the Prairie. It really was kind of like that. I remember my mom crocheted or knitted these bonnets when we were in elementary school. And I know it sounds funny, but they had like these fake ringlets that were crocheted that hung down, and then you had like a pom-pom on the back, and then you tied it under your chin, like it would come around your face like that. She made me a green one, and when I was a little girl, I'd put my bonnet on. I know that sounds so funny, but go get on the school bus and go to school. I was so proud to wear that bonnet that my mom made me. I don't know if you'd call it a bonnet, but I think it was like a bonnet because it came around and tied under your chin, and then it had these cute little ringlet things that would bounce around. And so my parents were just hardworking, productive. We had a special room just for food storage. And I think one of the things I love about Mormonism is the organization, just the order, because it was important to be organized. It was important to live your life in order, not chaos. And so it was important to have like a clean house. It was important to have things perfectly in order. So you go downstairs into the storage room, and there were shelves on each side of the room from the floor to the ceiling, and every one of those shelves would be full of canned in glass quart jars, canned food from our garden. And there would be 3 or 4 freezers full of deer meat, either, lard from our pigs, or pork from our pigs, beef from our calf that would grow up and get butchered, and chickens. And my parents were avid fishermen. They loved fishing. We lived on the Snake River, but a lot of the fish you would catch out of the Snake River would be like carp, or what we called suckers. And those weren't the kind of fish that you ate. So my parents would go to all the lakes and fish all around where we lived in Idaho. So we would have mostly rainbow trout. But freezers full of meat. And with those, just so you know, with those blocks of lard from the pigs, we would make spud nut donuts. Yes, you would make donuts out of potatoes, because Idaho's about potatoes, and you would make spud nut donuts. And we would make spud nut donuts. We would make homemade ice cream. We would make, and my mother was the one who would make this, but homemade caramel popcorn. And every Christmas my mom would make taffy, and we would pull the taffy, and homemade chocolates. And my mom would make the center part of the chocolate, and then we would dip those in chocolate and set those out to harden and make our own chocolates. My parents were very, it was important for them to read to us, so they would read us all of the classics. They read us the Little House on the Prairie books. They read us the Hobbit books. They read us Treasure Island and Alice in Wonderland and Robinson Crusoe and Sinbad the Sailor. And I remember my father on many Christmas Eves reading us The Journey to Bethlehem out of the Bible, or we would listen to it on a record. But it was important to my parents to teach us the birth of Christ and teach us about Joseph and Mary's journey to Bethlehem. We also studied our scriptures, and we weren't always consistent, but we were consistent when we were doing it to some degree. So it was hit and miss, sometimes, but there were many mornings that we would wake up at 5 o'clock and read our scriptures as a family. And then we would kneel together and say family prayer. And we would say prayer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I remember there were times when we would kneel down around our chairs at the dining room table, and we would say family prayer like that. There was a time when my father decided, and it was probably because there were 8 children and it was very noisy, I'm sure, and my father was a quiet man. I'm sure he needed a break sometimes. But he started a tradition where my mother would serve the food on the table for dinner. And it wasn't just for dinner. It was, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because my mother always made sure that breakfast, lunch, and dinner were made. And, of course, she had 5 daughters, so we could help with that as we got older. But when we sat around the table as a family, my father would sit at the head of the table. And my father was not an arrogant, egotistical man. He was just a quiet, kind, strong, elegant man that was kind of a cowboy. Not a rough and tough cowboy like what you see, an elegant cowboy. And my dad would sit at the head of the table, and then he would tell all of us children that we were going to have a minute of silence. And there was a clock up on the wall. And he'd say, everyone, we're going to have that minute of silence, and it's time to be silent. And we would all watch that clock tick, 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 tick around one whole minute. And then after that minute and we had been quiet, it was time to fold our arms and say prayer on the food. And when we finished that prayer, and we would, my father would choose someone to say the prayer. And then when we finished our prayer, then we would pass the food around the table in one direction, and everybody would serve themselves. I remember watching my father. I love my father so much. He was the apple of my eye, my hero. I love my father. And I remember watching his eyes because I was a very inquisitive child, and I was a child that wanted to pay close attention to people and their behaviors and watch detail. And I would watch closely, especially my father. I would watch his eyes when he was eating his plate of food. I would watch where he was looking to see what he wanted seconds of, so I could be the first to ask him, Dad, would you like some corn? Or Dad, would you like some, whatever it was that his eyes were looking at. I wanted to be the first to ask him if he wanted seconds of that. I loved him so much. I would watch so that I could serve him and please my father. When my father would come home from work, he would walk through the door, and 5 little girls would run to be the first one to take his boots off, because we loved our dad so much, and he made each one of us feel that we were his favorite. But I still know I'm his favorite because I was the feisty one, and my dad had a nickname for me, and it was Red. He used to call me Red, and that's probably because I had a fiery temper, and I would get angry and want to fight and want to argue, and I was very feisty that way, and still am. But of course, as you get older, you calm down a little bit from what you used to be when you were younger. And my parents, more my father than my mother, because it was considered his job to discipline us children. Well, my mother would probably spank the girls, but we would get the belt. And if you were naughty, you were going to get the belt. And if you didn't get the belt, you were going to get the hand, and that was going to hurt too. But one time I remember me and my sister, we were messing around, and my mother told us that we needed to, I can't remember if she told us that we needed to do some chores or we needed to do something, and we didn't. So my mother was coming in from the garden outside, and I told my sister, run and get as many pairs of pants as you can get on, because I knew we were going to get spanked. And so we ran and put as many pairs of pants over each other as we could, and then I had a long dress that we would play in, and I put that dress on that went all the way down to my ankles, and hoping that my mother wouldn't see, that I had like 10 pairs of pants on, because I wanted to soften the blow of that spanking I knew I was going to get. And she took us in the bathroom, and we each got a spanking. And I still have a hard time believing that my mother couldn't feel all that padding on our butts, because there's no way that she didn't know that we had put so many pairs of pants on so that we could soften the blow. But we just had so many good memories and good things in our life, and I loved growing up Mormon. I loved Mormon traditions. I liked our family prayer. I liked scripture study. I liked my father reading the Bible, because my father wasn't the one that was religious, so it was always kind of ironic that my father was the one reading the journey to Bethlehem. I loved it when my parents read to us every night. And emphasized being educated, and the, of course, reading was how you became educated. The more you read, the smarter you would be. So we had our own, kind of library in our house because books were important. I remember so many nights, like during the winter, listening to the wind howl outside around the outside of the house, and like laying on the floor by the Christmas tree, and how wonderful it was to be loved and protected by my parents. There was a tradition that my mother had, that when Santa Claus came on Christmas morning, Santa would bring a whole case of oranges, not just, and we'd get an orange in the bottom of our sock, but he would also bring a whole case of oranges, and that case of oranges would be sitting there with the lid off so you could see all the oranges when you got up on Christmas morning. And then, of course, every Sunday, without fail, we went to church, and the Sabbath day was meant to be kept holy. My parents would tell us, like, we were never allowed to swim on Sunday because we were not allowed to get in the water, because according to Mormons and my mother, Satan ruled the water on Sunday. And if you got in the water on Sunday, then you were in danger and something bad might happen to you. So swimming was never allowed on Sunday. And sometimes we were restricted from playing sports on Sunday, like just going out after church and, playing softball with each other or basketball with each other or riding our bikes. Sometimes that was prohibited. But my parents weren't stringent, so there were some Sundays, they probably needed us to get out of the house. So there were some Sundays that we were allowed to go do things. But I remember this one Sunday my father and mother told us, and this was at a time when you would go to church in the morning and then you would go to sacrament meeting, which was the main meeting at night, like 6 o'clock that night. So it was split up. So we had gone to church that morning, and then there was that gap in between, and my parents told me I was not allowed to ride my bike because it was Sunday. So I loved riding my bike, and I still love riding my bike, and I really wanted to ride my bike. So I went and I snuck my bike out, and we lived out in the country, so I'm riding my bike. I snuck it out down to the end of the driveway, and I start riding my bike. And of course, when you're being naughty and you're disobeying, of course something bad's going to happen. And that was that the front tire of my bike got caught in the gravel on the side of the road, and it twisted my tire to one side, and I flipped over the handlebars and landed on my knees on the gravel, on the asphalt, and my knees were pretty messed up, but I was breaking the rules and disobeying. So, and we had to go to church that night, and I knew I had to hide what I had done. So I went back home, and it was time to get ready for church, and I put a long dress on so that nobody could see my knees. And my knees were bleeding and in pain, and so I walked stiffly to the car, but I could feel the blood running down my legs. And I knew at that moment that there was no hiding. I mean, I was going to have blood dripping all over the ground, and it was going to be obvious that there was a problem there. So I I grabbed my dad's arm and I kind of tugged at his arm and I pulled my dress up and just showed him my knees. And my dad was so startled that my knees were bleeding all over the place right before we were getting in the car to go to church. And I think my dad and I got to stay home from church that day. So great. I love that. So, and I think my dad loved it too, because like I said, my dad was not staunch Mormon. So, he liked, those moments of reprieve. And it was a good excuse for him to stay home with me. And I think that's what happened. Anyway, that's all I'm going to tell you today. But like I said, there were moments that were difficult as a child. But for the most part, my childhood was beautiful and secure and organized and safe in many ways. Not the sexual abuse part, because I've talked about that. But the majority of the time, my parents took really good care of us and had a sense of duty to make sure that we were raised well and taught well and protected. I'll always love my parents for what they gave me. And the truth is, I'll always love the Mormon Church and what they gave me. They gave me so many things. And that's why at 57, sometimes there's the dilemma in my mind of, I don't want to throw away everything because everything wasn't bad. Most of it was so good. And it is my heritage. And I want to keep the good things and get rid of the bad.